Great. Hi, everyone. It looks like a few more people are joining us, but I think we'll just get started. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Advancing Family, Friend, and Neighbor Child Care Research. I'm Bernadette Sangalang, and I'm the Child and Family Director at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. I'm a founding member of Homegrown and currently serve in its steering committee, and I'm happy to be facilitating today's conversation on behalf of Homegrown. Family, Friend, and Neighbor Care, or FFN for short, has long been an area of focus for us at the Packard Foundation. Over the past decade, we've invested in new research on FFN care, including some of the research you will learn about today. These investments have been rooted in our deep belief that children and families benefit from FFN care, and that this care option should be better supported via policy than practice. This belief led us to support the formation of Homegrown, which has had a focus on family, friend, and neighbor care from its inception. Today, we're very excited to hear about the rich research surrounding FFN care and to learn more about who FFN caregivers are, why families choose this care, and how we can better support this important care option. We know there's much more to do to recognize, celebrate, and invest in FFN care, and building a better understanding of the characteristics and circumstances of the children, families, and providers in this setting will support efforts to deepen this investment. So for today's agenda, it will include a video from an FFN caregiver, followed by presentations from the researchers joining us today. And then we'll have a panel discussion followed by some time for a Q&A. So we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A and we will answer throughout the presentation. And there will also be time to ask questions live at the end of the discussion. And to kick us off, we're going to watch a short video from Gisela Sands, a family friend and neighbor caregiver in Austin, Texas. In the video, she's being interviewed by Homegrown FFN consultant Joycelyn Felix. Gisela currently participates in Leading from Home, which is a homegrown program that supports leaders like Gisela in convening and building their peer networks.
¿Por qué FFN? Y ya dijimos que es FFN. ¿Por qué es tan importante el cuidado infantil FFN para los niños, para las familias y para los proveedores?
Ok, pues nosotras como cuidadora de FFN sentimos mucha importancia porque ayudamos en los hogares a personas con las mismas culturas, el mismo idioma, ¿verdad? Esa es una de las cosas. Y muchas personas no confían en los centros grandes, confían en nosotras las proveedoras porque ellos se han dado cuenta que nosotros cuidamos a los niños con el mismo amor y el mismo respeto. Independientemente de eso, también los preparamos, ¿verdad? Para cuando van a la escuela y hablamos su mismo idioma, las mismas culturas. Entonces, ese es un punto del por cuál es importante y por qué nos buscan también a nosotras. Y somos 24/7 muchas veces.
Sí, muy buen punto ese también, ¿verdad? La disponibilidad. ¿Puedes elaborar un poquito más sobre eso de la disponibilidad? ¿Puedes hacer una diferencia entre los centros u otras personas contra un FFN, ¿verdad?
Sí, claro.
Que tiene esa... ¿Puedes expanderte un poquito más en esa disponibilidad 24/7 de la que tú hablas?
Sí, porque, pues, como le digo, ¿verdad? También cuando empezó lo de la pandemia, los centros cerraron muchos y ahí fue cuando yo tuve también aumentó los niños porque no querían cuidar por el temor o las reglas, ¿verdad? Que pone el Estado y X cosa. Entonces nosotros las proveedoras lo que hicimos fue apoyar a la comunidad en ese momento que necesitaban que cuidáramos de sus niños. Entonces nosotros, somos flexibles con los papás a lo que es el pago, que claro, los papás no ganan mucho dinero y muchas veces nos quieren pagar más, pero no pueden, ¿verdad? Lamentablemente. Y el 24/7 lo digo siempre porque hay veces que me hablan y me dicen, oh, Gisela, tengo enfermo a mi esposo y no puedo llevar al niño. Entonces yo le digo, oh, sí, no hay problema, tráemelo. Entonces esa es una de las cosas que es la diferencia entre una proveedora de casa o un centro, porque el centro va, si le tocas la puerta no te lo van a abrir, obviamente. En cambio nosotros aquí en el hogar estamos siendo flexibles y estamos apoyando a la comunidad.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias.
De
La
nada.
siguiente pregunta es, ¿qué tiene de especial el cuidado de FFN?
Lo que hace especial el cuidado. Bueno, yo siento en lo personal que a mí me gusta porque he llegado a tener mucha comunicación, mucho diálogo con los papás, muchas veces apoyo entre padres y cuidadoras, como por ejemplo en la vecindad, ¿verdad? Yo cuido niños de la vecindad y muchas veces para mí es importante porque los papás están confiando en mí. Los papás me tienen esa confianza en decir, oh, te lo puedo dejar hasta que se quede a dormir contigo, me los han dejado, hasta los levantan hasta otro día. Entonces, eso para mí es muy importante porque estoy demostrando confianza y ellos tienen confianza hacia mí. Otras cosas, de las cosas que sí me preocupa bastante, ¿verdad, señor? Es que no, no nos pagan, ¿verdad? Lo que debemos cobrar nosotras porque como le comenté anteriormente, ellos no ganan mucho dinero. Entonces, el estatus también es muy importante. El estatus muchas veces nos discriminan a nosotros, a otras personas o a otras organizaciones por nuestro estatus migratorio. En cambio, aquí en la comunidad no nos discriminamos porque hablamos el mismo idioma, nos comunicamos y sobre todo el respeto, Señor, la confianza, el ayudar al prójimo. Entonces, eso es lo que yo estoy haciendo y estoy elaborando como liderazgo y como líder en la comunidad.
We're so appreciative to Gisela for sharing her experiences and her perspective with us. Now I would like to introduce our guests.
¿Por qué?
Oops, Gisela. I'll ask each of our guests to take a couple of minutes to share a little bit about themselves and the study they'll be presenting. Please note that their full bios are in the background document that's in the chat. So today we're joined by Tony Porter of Early Care and Education Consulting, Phil Fisher from the Stanford Center in Early Childhood at Stanford University, Anna Powell of the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment at UC Berkeley, and Megan Angus from Mathematica. So I'll now turn it over to Tony to share a little bit about herself and her study.
Thank you very much, Megan. Not Megan. Thank you very much, Bernadette. I'm Tony Porter, and as Bernadette just indicated, I'm a principal at Early Care and Education Consulting, and I'm also working as a key consultant on the Home-Based Child Care Supply and Quality Project, a 5-year effort funded by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation on the federal government. The study I'm going to report on today is based on secondary data analysis of the National Survey of Early Care and Education, NSECE, which is the most comprehensive and nationally representative data on the child care and early education workforce. I'm reporting on the 2019 survey results, and that is the second wave of the survey. The first was conducted in 2012. Our analysis is derived from both public and restricted samples of listed providers and unlisted providers who responded to the home-based child care provider questionnaire.
Thank you, Tony.
You're welcome.
How about Phil?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Phil Fisher. I direct the Stanford Center on Early Childhood at Stanford, which launched last fall. I will be reporting on a project called the RAPID Survey, which began in the fall of 2020, and then, I'm sorry, in the spring of 2020, and then extended in the spring of 2021 to include a national sample of providers in the early childhood workforce, with a particular emphasis in partnership with Homegrown and others on FFN providers. The survey takes about 15 minutes to complete, available in English or Spanish via tablet, smartphone, or computer. To date, we've had over 4,000 providers take the survey. You can see from this slide, we cover a variety of different areas, including the well-being of the workforce, working conditions, issues like material hardship, ability to pay for basic needs, and healthcare. And one of the unique features of the survey is that it includes both qualitative and quantitative questions. The qualitative take the form of open-ended questions. We've had a lot of responses over the course of time. And I think one of the things that distinguishes this survey is its frequency. So it goes out on a monthly basis, and really started as an effort to document the experiences of households with young kids and providers during the pandemic, and more recently has really shifted to just focus on the overall picture of adults in the lives of young children as we move forward and come out of the pandemic.
Thank you, Phil. Anna?
Thank you so much. My name is Anna Powell. I'm from the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment at UC Berkeley. And while we are primarily known for our licensed workforce research, I'm here to share today about our study of FFN and nanny care in California. So this study is ongoing. We're currently closing focus groups, for example, with FFN providers. But what I'll be sharing with you today is the parent survey that we concluded last fall, where we reached about 1,300 parents, English and Spanish language, to learn about the ways in which FFN care features into their arrangements or not. And why do they choose that care? What do they value about it? And how would that fit into their ideal arrangement, even if they're not able to access it now? So I'm going to be sharing some survey findings with you in the presentation today. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Anna. And Megan?
Hi, my name is Megan Haig Angus, and I'm a researcher with Mathematica. My team and I at Mathematica enjoyed conducting a study which we called Understanding the Strengths of Family, Friend, and Neighbor Care. And our study was purely qualitative. So we had the pleasure of talking with both providers and parents several times over the course of our study. And all providers and parents lived in New York or Minnesota. And we asked providers to speak with us as an interview, and then they had a follow-up, but also to get a better sense of what quality care looked like to providers. We asked them to submit photos of where they provided care, both in indoor and outdoor spaces, and a whole bunch of other examples of what quality care looks like to them. And then also they recorded some of their thoughts and reflections. So our study really focused on kind of capturing the voice of both providers and parents.
Thanks, Megan. We're so thrilled to have these colleagues joining us, and I'll ask them to share more about their research. So Tony will kick us off, and she'll share more about who FFN caregivers are and their demographics. Then Phil will present data surrounding the economic well-being of FFN caregivers. Then after Phil, Anna will share her research on why parents use this form of care, and then Megan will discuss her findings around what parents value about FFN care. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Bernadette. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. A word about the NSECE definitions. Listed providers, the pie chart you see on the very left, were identified through lists. They are most likely regulated family childcare providers, licensed, certified, or registered, although they may also include FFN providers who are legally exempt from regulation, who appear on lists of public childcare and education programs, such as subsidy or CICFP. Unlisted providers, the two pie charts on the right, are those who regularly care for children 5 hours a week for a child who is not their own. They were identified through household surveys where a parent was asked who her caregiver was. Most likely, these are FFN providers. They may be relatives or friends or neighbors. The NSECE divides this category of unlisted into those who report that they are paid, that's the middle pie chart, by parents or through public funding, and those who do not receive payment. The more than 5 million unlisted providers dwarfs the 91,000 listed providers. By my calculations, these FFN caregivers account for 98% of the home-based childcare workforce. And combined, they provided care for 10 times the number of children under 13. About 1 million of these unlisted providers received payment for their care. The remaining 4 million reported that they did not receive payment. One of the big takeaways that is not shown here is the sharp distinction in trends over time. The family childcare workforce, listed providers, is declining. The number of providers dropped by 25% between the 2012 and 2019 surveys. But the FFN workforce has remained stable, even growing slightly, with the number of unpaid providers increasing by 2%. Next slide, please. Take it all the way through, please. Thank you very much. Okay, here's where the analysis gives us some new insights. Unlisted paid providers were most likely to identify as Hispanic, Latino, or Black non-Hispanic. By comparison, 60% of unlicensed unpaid providers identified as white non-Hispanic. Next slide, please. Take it all the way through. Thank you. Great. Okay. Whoops. Back up. Thank you. Great. More nuances emerging of the emerging portrait of unlisted paid providers as members of a marginalized groups of color. Unlisted paid providers were more likely to be immigrants, to report being immigrants, almost double the proportion of unpaid providers, and higher proportions of unlisted paid providers reported speaking a language other than English. What's interesting here, though, is that the proportions for unlisted paid providers are pretty close to those for listed providers. Next slide, please. And more, all the way through. Great, thank you. Unlisted paid providers reported the lowest household incomes by a considerable margin, over 15,000 per year less than unpaid providers and over 25,000 less than listed providers. And this wasn't because these providers live with fewer household members contributing to earnings or had fewer household members to support. In fact, they tend to live in households with more family members and not less. Unlisted paid providers also reported far lower proportions of home ownership relative to other groups. About 30% own their own home compared to 60% of unlisted unpaid providers and 80% of listed providers. Next slide, please. Thank you. We found that both unlisted paid and unlisted unpaid providers were more likely to report being in fair or poor health than listed providers. Unlisted paid providers were also the most likely to report being uninsured compared to unpaid providers and listed providers. Next slide, please. Oops, good, great, thank you. Nope, back up, down, sorry, here we go. This is animations that I have trouble controlling, so I'm sure other people do too. Some interesting findings here, although some are obvious. Next slide, I'm sorry. That's great. Next slide. Go on down, Karen. There we go. Okay, thank you. Unlisted unpaid providers reported caring for the fewest children, just 2 on average, followed by unlisted paid providers, about 3 kids, and then listed providers with about 8.6 kids. This likely reflects the licensing thresholds for exempt providers. What's interesting here is the ages of children served. So click, please. Great, okay, thank you. Half of the children served by unlisted unpaid providers were school-aged, so over 5 years old, higher than the percentage with unlisted paid providers and that with listed providers. By contrast, unlisted unpaid providers serve the smallest proportion of infants and toddlers, but the proportion of infants and toddlers served by unlisted paid providers was close to that of listed providers. These findings suggest that unlisted, unpaid providers fill a gap in support for children who are school age, and that unlisted paid providers fill a gap for children, for infants and toddlers. Thank you. Hours, okay, great. This next slide is also significant, I think, for our implications. And you can see here that unlisted, unpaid providers operated for the greatest number of non-standard hours per week, about 12.7, about 12.5, about a quarter more than the paid providers, and 2/3 more than the listed providers. Thank you. Over to Phil.
Thanks, Tony. Excited to follow up with, I think, what is a lot of consistent information. So if we could just advance the slides, that would be great. So in our survey, one of the things that we've been doing as we survey the overall workforce is to look at how FFN providers report their hourly pay relative to others in the childcare and early care and education space. And what you can see here is that relative to babysitters, nannies, center directors, and teachers, and home-based providers in other categories, that FFNs have by far and away the lowest hourly pay rate. And in fact, the median pay rate in our sample of the FFN providers is 0, although as you can see, there's some variation there. But really, quite noteworthy that the hourly pay for providers is as low as it is for FFNs. Next slide, please. Not surprisingly, when you consider what the hourly pay rate would be, then when you look at different types of providers, and we ask the question of, in the past month, have you had difficulty paying for any of the following? And those the categories include housing, utilities, food, childcare, healthcare, or other basic necessities. You can see that over 40% of the FFN providers in our sample say that they're having difficulty paying for one or more basic needs, and that's about 10% more than either center-based or home-based providers who are not FFN. So significantly more material hardship. This is cumulatively since we started following the workforce, the provider workforce, in April of 2021. Next slide, please. Relatedly, because we do the survey on a monthly basis, you can look at how the trends of at least one area of material hardship have varied across time in these different categories of providers. And what's noteworthy here is that the royal blue line is the FFN providers in our sample. And what you can see is that relative to other groups, with perhaps the exception of center-based teachers, who are also known to have very low compensation rates, FFN providers have consistently been in the highest group in terms of reporting the rates of material hardship that they're experiencing. Let's look at the next slide. Again, not surprisingly, if you think about the proportion of FFN providers in our sample who were reporting not getting paid for providing FFN care, we also asked, and again, this is cumulatively across time, the percentage of providers who have other non-child care jobs in addition to providing care. And what you can see is that we have over 40%, so significantly more than any other category of provider, although a close second is babysitters and nannies, who are working other jobs in addition to providing care for other people's children. Next slide, please. Relatedly, and I'm hoping this is an area that we'll be able to talk about in the context of the Q&A. I know Homegrown has been doing some really excellent work in this area. When we think about these issues as they apply to housing, one of the things that's really been noteworthy in our data is the extent to which FFN providers are reporting far and away the highest rates of any category of provider in terms of difficulty paying for housing. So that includes for those who own their own homes, paying the mortgage, and for those who are renting, being able to afford the rent. But I think also noteworthy, and this is an area where there's starting to be some really interesting innovation around whether there can be more likelihood of secure housing for people who are renting and providing FFN care. We see 38% of the FFN providers are concerned about being evicted, and that's not just because of lack of payment of the rent, but for other reasons where the people that they're renting from may not be comfortable with them running any kind of care operations out of their home. So even relative to family child care, where we see 28% concerns about eviction, we see significantly higher rates among FFN providers. Next slide. I think it's noteworthy, this has been true in our household survey as well, that the more hardships that people are reporting, and you can see this on the left-hand side, the more hardships that providers are reporting, the greater proportion, or rather the greater amount of emotional distress that they're also reporting. And we measure emotional distress as a composite of 4 different areas: stress, anxiety, loneliness, and depression. And so you can see that as the number of areas in which providers are having difficulty paying for basic needs, the greater the amount of emotional distress they're reporting. Similarly, we have been looking at hunger using a US Department of Agriculture scale that includes 6 items. And as you can see, the amount of food insecurity out of the 6 items that are being responded to is directly related to also to emotional distress. So more distress, or sorry, more hardship associated with these economic issues, more distress in terms of what providers are describing. Next slide, please. So these are just, and this is my last slide, these are just some comments from parents from our parent survey about the roles that they see providers playing in their lives. And the centrality of the childcare workforce, and in particular the FFN workforce, in terms of allowing families to be able to provide the kind of nurturing care that they desire for their children, and the role that these individuals play as a critical member of kind of the family constellation. So I think these sort of the first set of slides speaks to the challenges, and to a certain extent, this last slide suggests that the expectations we have as a society of providers is that they're going to do this work regardless of the very challenging circumstances that they're in. And I think that's something that probably brings a lot of us together today to this FFN presentation or set of presentations. Thank you. And I believe Anna is next. Is that correct? Okay, so passing the baton to you, Anna.
Thanks, Phil. Next up, let's turn to the parent perspective. And as a reminder, this was based on a survey conducted in California statewide this past fall, actually with the partnership of Phil's Shop at Rapid. So we're going to be looking at what parents told us about how frequently they're using FFN care, which parents, the factors that went into their decision, and what kind of ECE arrangement they think is ideal. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So in our survey of 1,310 parents all across California, we had parents with children somewhere under the age of 6, right? So some had 1 child in that age group, some had more than 1. But among those parents who had a child under 3, 26% reported using FFN care, and 29% reported using that for their child age 3 to 5. And this was separate from nanny care in our study. But I want to point out that there, of course, were some differences by the background of parents. So the Black parents in our sample were the most likely to use FFN care, especially for their little ones under the age of 3, 34% of those parents. But we did observe that families across income levels rely on FFN care, which definitely aligns with other work that has been done in this area. We also found that there was care in combination, about 20 to 30% of the parents in our sample, for example. And in this case, when they had a combination, FFN care was very commonly part of that combination. On the topic of compensation, we only found that 28% did not provide compensation. And you might be thinking, that sounds too low, it should be much higher. And the reason for that is in our study, we also asked about things besides cash. We asked about whether, for example, the parent was providing non-monetary support, such as helping their FFN with food or housing, gas, and other supplies like that. So we found that about half of the parents in our sample were doing something of that, and that the remainder were either using cash or perhaps a combination of cash and non-monetary exchange. So really all sorts of different arrangements, but ones which definitely encompass oftentimes $0 of payment, as we've seen in these other studies. Next slide, please. Let's now look at these decision factors. So just to orient you to what we're looking at here, this is looking at specifically the parents with children aged 3 to 5. And in each column, I've grouped them by the choices that the parents have made for their different care arrangements. So the FFN using parents are in the dark blue. And then what we did was we asked them about different factors, and I'm giving you a few of them here in each row. And they told us whether that was somewhat important, not important. And what you're seeing here is the share who said it was very important to their decision. So surprise, surprise, health and safety was very important to the majority of parents, even in any of these different care arrangements, including the gray, where parents were using parental care only. Cost was also very important, especially important to those who ended up with parental care only. Learning opportunities we see is a bit lower for FFN and nanny care. And what we heard from our parent advisory group was that when they went out and purchased a licensed care arrangement, they were specifically looking to purchase something that aligned with a learning opportunity. But this perhaps kind of does a disservice, I would say, to the types of learning that goes on in FFN care, but is not the whole story. Because looking inside this red box where I want to draw your attention, these areas of personal connection, language spoken, cultural background, when you compare across the columns, the FFN families are more often saying these are very important factors to my decision compared to those who were in a licensed care setting, even a licensed home-based setting. And it kind of almost aligns with what they had for the parental care only parents. So these are important salient factors to parents who choose FFN care that are strengths of that care and aligns with what Gisela told us in the video at the beginning. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So in this last section, in our survey, we told the parents, I want you to imagine that you are not constrained by the budget that you have, the COVID context around you, if that's still a factor, and the options that are with you. Think about what is truly the ideal arrangement for your child. And in the dark blue, we have their feelings for the children under 3, and then their opinion in the gold for age 3 to 5. And they could take any various option, or they could at the bottom of the chart, they could once again choose a combination or even parental care only. But what I want you to take away from this chart overall is that there's no one dominant option. There's not, for example, a dominant preference for a license or even center-based care. It's a little more popular in an ideal arrangement for age 3 to 5, but FFN care is in there and still very common. In fact, for the under 3, it's about as commonly the ideal arrangement as center-based care. Drawing your attention to this top row, though, the parents who said, well, my current arrangement is already my ideal. We looked deeper to say, well, who selected this option? Was it one type of care that was the most common? And no, once again, parents in all kinds of arrangements already felt that they had their ideal. And in the case of the under 3, it was about even shares of FFN parents and center-based parents and combination parents. I will say, though, that the parents using parental care only were somewhat less likely to feel that, yes, they already had their ideal arrangement. So what do we take from this? Just to sum up, FFN care does have unique strengths. It's not a care of last resort. And fundamentally, there's also just no one type of care that suits all families at all time points in their child's development. Our system needs to be reflective of that and empower parents to choose among these options. That concludes my section, and I'll pass it down to Megan.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm very grateful to be here to share some of what we've been learning in our study. Next slide, please. As we tried to really understand the strengths of this type of care. So providers and parents highlighted the importance of trust and relationships, just like the video started with. Having a sense of trust is incredibly important to parents and also is important to providers and their ability to establish that trust. So providers described some of the strategies that they use to build trust with children. One provider talked about how important it was to her to make eye contact with children and meet them at their eye level. And several spoke about establishing warm relationships through showing affection. Other providers talked about how important feeding time was, especially of infants, as we talk about young children here, that it was a chance for them to hold and cuddle the children and reassure them that they're well cared for. I thought it was interesting that in our study, a few providers used the word respect, especially of toddlers and preschool children, to describe the relationship that they had between themselves and the children in their care. And that also means that you got to encourage children to learn from their mistakes. So that was something that became really important to them. So I have a quote on the side. My presentation will have a lot of quotes. I will read it in case anyone is having trouble seeing it. So I am happy with the relationship I have with the parents because they are happy. The parents, just like the kids, are happy when they arrive and leave happy as well. I think it's important for the parents to know that they're leaving their children in a good place. This helps me with the relationships I have with the kids. It's very cordial. So that's the provider's perspective. And a mom also kind of talked a little bit about this relationship of trust and how that gets established. And she said, my most important thing is my kids being taken care of. And they trust the provider. They play with her and they pretty much do everything with her. So why not? I don't trust other people taking care of my kids, to be honest. So trust is something we heard over and over again. And a little bit more around this is that parents really talk to the providers and ask them for advice on child development, discipline, nutrition, and other aspects of childcare. And just really having a partnership in terms of brainstorming solutions to some of common challenges, of course, but also ones that might be specific to developmental delays. So parents really describe the relationship with the providers as strong, trusting, close, and very special. Great, next slide, please. We also wanted to look a little bit into the idea of long-term relationships. And we found that FFN providers foster these long-term relationships by providing children and families with consistent, stable care. And we know from other research that this consistent, dependable relationships really can form the foundation of child's attachment to adults. And FFN care can enable the same provider to provide consistent, secure care to the same child over a number of years. Children might find it disruptive when multiple providers care for them in different changing childcare settings. So the providers we spoke with described how long they provided care to the children that they cared for, and how long they provided childcare to families in their community. So we wanted to also share a little bit about the fact on the quote there that she says, I took care of a girl for about 6 years. And now she's a young 16-year-old lady. She sees me and talks to me and greets me because her mother says, that was the lady that took care of you when you were little. Just a little bit of a sense of how long some of these relationships are. And providers did talk to us a lot about how they provided care for the same child or often multiple children from the same family across different years. So we explored the longest time a provider had provided childcare to a child, and this varied. We have a small sample, but the time span varied from less than a year to 14 years, and the average long time that providers cared for children was about 5 years. So that consistent, stable care was a key feature that is unique to home-based care. Next slide, please. Great, and this is my last slide. It's kind of exciting to talk about all these things, but providers that we were talking to are very responsive to children's needs and support children's development. So our staff at Mathematica asked providers to name some examples of when they responded to children, infants and toddlers, and to think about how they really helped children regulate their emotions. And providers answered with various situations in which they worked to be responsive, and how they kind of made sure that children felt heard and valued. So they talked very intentionally about being responsive to different situations in like an intentional way, but also responding physically, right? Where their strategies might be, especially if the child is young, holding them, bouncing the child, patting their back, these physical signs of affection to be responsive to what's going on inside the child's mind or kind of externally in these moments of distress. And they talked a lot about speaking calmly and encouragingly when children express their needs. So a quote on the screen, and I'll just kind of summarize it here, but I try to speak to them in a calm voice. That's why they love to be around me. If they do something wrong, I am not just going to try and say, hey, you did this wrong. I'm going to encourage them and offer suggestions. I always like to make their self-esteem high, not to lower it. I always let them know that they're somebody. So not by yelling, screaming at them. This is just how we communicate, me and them. I talk to them nicely with a calm voice. So just to get a little bit about, what this care looks like from the perspective of the provider. If I have one more moment, which I'm not sure I do, but I could just say that, that we also really kind of explored the fact that because there's so few children, to Tony's point, in some of these childcare situations, that they really could offer some individualized care to the children, so that if the children expressed interest, they could really capture that in the care that they offer children. So thank you so much for letting me share just a few insights from our study. It's really been great to speak with so many parents and providers.
Thank you so much, Megan. And thanks to Tony, Phil, and Anna. These are such rich presentations. It's just so great to hear them all in one place. And so I'm always learning something new from each and every one of you. Now we're going to turn it over to our panel questions. And I have a question for each of you. So I'll start off with a question for Tony. So Tony, we know that access to public funds is often tied to meeting quality standards. So how do the data from the National Survey of Early Care and Education study help us understand the level of quality and need for quality supports among FFN caregivers?
Thank you, Bernadette. That's kind of complicated because the NSCCA only directly got at features of quality. But there are some findings in the study that seem to point to FFN providers' interest in improving the quality of their care. And I'll just be brief and share them. So about 1/3 of the paid providers indicated that they saw this work as a career. So if motivation is related to quality, there's that finding. And also more than half of them aim to continue to do this work for more than 5 years, which indicates a commitment to doing this work and perhaps quality. And it also suggests that there's a potential for engaging some of these providers, particularly the paid providers who look like FFN providers in licensed systems. And, for good or for ill, licensing does provide a floor for quality around health and safety of the environment. There are other data in here that kind of parallel a little bit what Megan was talking about. The NSCC asked folks whether they planned activities for kids. And we know that being intentional about your work is an element of quality. And about 2/3 of the paid providers and about half of the unpaid providers said that they plan daily activities, which is kind of an indication that there's a potential for quality in here. And then in addition to that, we know that kind of interest in engaging with other providers may provide opportunities for folks to improve their quality. And the data here were really interesting. They showed that more than half of these providers knew where they could access other providers or other networks, and that a significant percentage of them actually engaged with those networks. So there's another potential here. I think the long short is, we don't talk about measuring quality, which I hope we'll get to later. There is lots of potential here for addressing quality issues, supporting quality, let's put it that way, in FFN care, if we kind of shift our perception of and our use of public funding towards FFN.
Thank you, Tony. That's really helpful. My next question is for Anna. Anna, your research tells us that families want and use FFN care, often in combination with other care options. There appears to be a disconnect between the care parents want and value and public funding to support the FFN care option. So what policy solutions should we consider to ensure parents can use and afford FFN care, and that FFN caregivers are appropriately compensated and supported?
Certainly. Our primary takeaway from this study is that our policy framework needs to embrace this expansive understanding of parents' wants and needs, rather than having an exclusive focus on one setting, especially a school-based or center-based setting, knowing that the ideal is so varied. And it's worth noting that we found that parents of color and immigrant parents were less likely to feel they already had access to their ideal. So it gives us a sense of where we should be focusing our efforts. So state policies that embrace this full definition of mixed delivery that really includes FFN, and also then particularly has the support for parents of color and immigrant parents to access that if it's their primary goal. The primary way that the states can do that is to look at their subsidy frameworks, the access to the subsidy, the rate that that subsidy can pay to lift the well-being of the families and the caregivers who participate in the system.
Thank you, Anna. My next question is for Phil. So Phil, given the hardship that FFN caregivers and other caregivers face, what policy opportunities, both within and outside of the early learning sector, should we consider to better support these caregivers?
Thanks for the question, Bernadette. I think, first of all, that the hardship issues that a number of us highlighted are in many ways the tip of the iceberg. So, for example, another question that we've asked is, how far in advance do you know your work schedule? And we find that over 30% of FFN providers say they know their daily work schedule less than 4 days in advance. And about 20% only know their work schedule 1 to 2 days in advance. If you combine that with the uncertainty of compensation among FFN providers, it's not simply whether people are paid or not, but also a question of whether and how they're going to get paid. And in the context of having uncertain schedules, it means that the amount of income that they're earning is very unstable and unreliable. I think one of the things that Homegrown has been doing recently that's really fascinating is a set of income pilots to help support with income sufficiency and stabilization. This is part of a larger movement that we're seeing nationally around income stabilization, cash transfer programs, and so forth. I think, to me, if we want to ensure that those providing care for children are providing the kind of quality that Tony was talking about, we have to ask sort of this fundamental question of whether we can expect anybody to provide sufficient nurturing and responsive care in the context of the kind of uncertainty and instability that we are asking of the provider workforce. And so the pilots that Homegrown is supporting in 5 different communities around the country, I think, begin to allow us to get a sense of what might be the policy implications of, for example, funding available slots as opposed to simply providing compensation for the number of hours that somebody takes care of somebody else's kids. I think that's one area. And then the other is, I think, policy issues around making housing available in the context of housing development, where there are provisions, especially in lower income housing contexts, for there to be home-based and family friend and neighbor care that's supported in the context of this kind of housing development process is another, I think, very interesting direction that policy discussions can move in. And there are, again, a number of different projects, one in Colorado, another one in Southern California, that are really looking into the question of how might more stable and sufficient housing allow the FFN workforce to be able to provide adequate care. So to me, the income part of this and the hardship part of it are part of these larger systemic and contextual issues. And I think it's important that we think about them in terms of when we have questions about policy as it relates to things like quality, how much these kinds of issues should be at the center of what we should be thinking about from an equity perspective.
Thank you, Phil. That's really helpful, and it's great to hear about the various innovations that are happening across the country. So Megan, my question for you is, there are many strengths of FFN care and aspects of this care that parents value that are not currently assessed as part of quality measures for early childhood education. And most measurement tools are not designed with this setting in mind. So how might we think about ways to measure and describe FFN quality?
Great. Thank you so much for that question. I think just reiterating what you said and what Anna's work demonstrates is that FFN care is an active choice by parents and something that is deliberate on their part. This is something that they seek out. And so as we think about developing measures of quality, including parent voice in what they feel is ideal should be important to consider. That is, one key feature should really involve the parent's perspective on that. And what's currently, available to measure quality might not really include those perspectives. For instance, thinking about, that the care feels like home is something that we looked into the study. I didn't have a chance to talk about it, but that's not something that necessarily comes up in some of the measures because it's pretty subjective. What does that feel like? But it's something that's important to families. So considering parent voice and perspective is important. And yes, the measures that we have are quite limited. Some of my colleagues, some of them are on this call, have looked at a whole bunch of measures of care and done really systematic reviews of those measures. And they basically are formed or modeled after center-based care. So it doesn't really capture some of these unique features of care that families and researchers and providers really associate with quality. So while some of those features of FFN might be included, there aren't enough that can really be used to assess quality in FFN care. And part of that's related to the space, of course, that FFN care is provided in. So really any attempt to assess quality, such as state licensing, or statewide QRIS, needs to carefully consider some of the nuances of FFN care as compared to center-based care, and think about some of those unique features, like trust that we talked about, responsiveness of caregivers, and work that into a measure.
Thank you, Megan. So we just have a few minutes, and so we'll take a few minutes to answer any questions from participants. And please put your questions in the Q&A. And I'll now invite Natalie from Homegrown to assist us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bernadette, and to our amazing panelists. I'm going to ask our facilitator, Bernadette, to answer a question. Wondering, Bernadette, what advice you might have for funders who prioritize home-based childcare and family friend and neighbor care in particular, and how might philanthropy help us further and advance research related to family friend and neighbor care?
I think it's important that funders continue to invest in filling the gaps in research about FFN care, and really share findings widely, such as a webinar like this, so that we can all have a better understanding of how to support and strengthen FFN care and the children in those settings. Research can help us to raise awareness of the important role of family friend and neighbor caregivers play in the child's life. And it can also help us promote a narrative that acknowledges the value of family friend and neighbor care. That can help us further make the case for advocating for policies that support FFN care.
I wonder, Anna, if you would be willing to share a little bit about, from your perspective, what ongoing gaps in the research around family friend and neighbor care are, either specific to your study or more broadly, and what's on your wish list for future research?
Absolutely. Gosh, I could talk all day about this. Well, with the focus groups that we're currently wrapping up with FFN caregivers, it of course gives rise to more questions. For example, we're really hearing from the FFNs that many of them, especially the grandparents, of course, were in the employed workforce, and being able to quantify, the amount of resources that they had that they basically gave up to take on this arrangement, I think could really speak to the level of not just what does the low pay mean, but the loss of that income and the true extent of the sacrifice that you could say that many people are making. Also, creative ways that we could, on the policy research side, as Phil was alluding to with housing, what are other creative strategies that we could be trying to examine or lift up, case studies around the country that would help us move to the what's next? What are the ways, now that we know all this about FFNs, that we can try to shift the narrative? And there might even be some further kind of segmenting of the supports. What do grandparents need? What do non-relative caregivers need? And what do those folks need who are never going to interact with our state systems because they're not part of subsidy? Also, the extent to which we can move away from a model that tries to nudge people to become licensed in order to access resources, I think those are also important things for us to explore and wrap our arms around to better understand how to help FFNs where they are now.
Awesome. All right. This is rapid fire for Tony and for Phil. Tony, I'm going to ask you to respond to the question in the chat that really talks about providers as being illegal and some of the rules governing FFN, and really how the research that we've discussed today can shift the narrative, right? So some of these really are legal and regulatory designations, but some of this is really about bias and around FFN care. So, in 1 minute, how can this research kind of move us forward from where we are now, both in terms of narrative, but also rules and policy?
Okay, I can do this in 1 minute. A, prevalence. These are the folks who are caring for our kids. And these are the folks who are caring for our most vulnerable kids and the kids of our marginalized families. So that's one. If you're going to put your money anywhere, you should put it in these folks' in supports for these folks. Two, the data suggest, belie the myth that this care is, forgive me for my language, crummy. There was an old idea that these caregivers were underground because they wanted to hide their care, because they tied up kids in the basement, because they stuck them on a couch somewhere. Our data, and this we hear it all across all of these studies, suggest that that is simply not true. And also there are other studies that were conducted several years ago that suggest that this care is in fact pretty good. The caregivers are nurturing, the settings are healthy and safe. There is stimulating care there, and then there are a couple of other findings. Okay, so that's another thing to shift it. The third thing is that I think that there are so many studies that indicate that these folks are interested in support. So that kind of belies the myth that you can't reach them, they don't want to talk to you, they're not interested in support. That's not what the research says. And then finally, just to address, because I think I have 20 seconds left, that the issue that Megan was raising, that other people were raising too, this question of quality. The measures we have were basically center-based. They don't take into account features of quality that we know are more common in this kind of care: support for racial and ethnic identity, supports for informal learning, support for children in mixed groups, which is a very distinctive feature of this care. So let's not set up one group over another. Let's get some support out there to FFN folks. And let's talk about how we measure the quality if there's something that we care about, and then integrate that into those systems that we have. Is that enough?
That's great. Phil, I'm going to ask you to tell us 20 seconds about why we need to invest in the emotional well-being of FFN caregivers, while we share our final slide with some follow-up opportunities from our partners. And then we'll give Bernadette 10 seconds to say goodbye. Go for it, Phil.
The emotional well-being of our provider workforce is critical. I think one of the things we've learned in our data is that providers will put the care and needs of the children in their care first, over and above their own well-being. But what that means is that we have a workforce that's neglecting their own well-being, and in many instances their health and emotional issues, in order to be able to meet the needs of young children. And again, what that means over time is that people burn out, that they become less effective, that they leave the field altogether, and a variety of other things. So we can't assume that just because providers are saying, no, even if I'm struggling because of all these things, I still put kids first, that that's okay. In fact, I think it's going to have long-term impacts on the workforce and on the society in general if we neglect it.
Wonderful. And I'll give you the final goodbye, Bernadette. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for spending time with us. And special thanks to our amazing guests. We hope this presentation has inspired you all to learn more about family-friendly neighbor care and to think about how to better include their needs in your program development, policymaking, and advocacy. And please join Homegrown and our partners for these 2 upcoming webinars, which are on the slide, to continue the conversation around family-friendly neighbor care. So thank you again so much and have a great rest of your day.